All right, we are getting started again. This time we are on chapter 10. So this chapter is all about aggression, hurting others. Aggression includes physical or verbal behavior. Please note that it includes not just physical, but also verbal behavior with the express intention to cause harm. So this definition does not include unintentional harm, neither does it include experiences where pain becomes a side effect of helping. So when you go to the dentist and you end up with dry sockets after getting something or pain from the procedure, the dentist's intent was not to cause harm, but it was to help you by fixing it. So that would not be constitute or considered aggression. Hostile aggression is driven by anger and it is performed as an end in itself. So I am angry at my husband who may have done something, excuse me, to me. And so I hit him, punch him, or say something that is very cruel to him. On the other side, instrumental aggression is aggression that is a means to some other end. So the text would have talked about wars, armed robbery, where the goal is to get money, not actually harm somebody. Sports, in the instance of the picture, that tackle is about stopping the person from getting to their mark so that they don't get points. However, there can be hostile aggression in sports as tempers flare and injustices may be perceived. So, using the example of sports without an explanation of the picture of the aggression may kind of be questionable whether it fits instrumental or hostile. So please know the differences between those two. All right, so when we think about theories of aggression, the first one we start with is biological. Freud suggested that aggression came from a self-destructive impulse. On the other end, Konrad Lorenz, who we would have known I think most of us would remember him from Psych 100 with imprinting. He saw aggression to be adaptive rather than self-destructive. What both of the theorists, the psychologists, had in common is this instinctual theory of aggression. And so aggression then, from this perspective, is unlearned and it is universal. And if it is not discharged, it is built up until it explodes or until an appropriate stimulus releases it. The visual that Myers used is what happens with the rat trap when it is triggered and it snaps. So that's kind of the imagery that you can get as it relates to aggression from this instinctual perspective where, something happens and we just snap. More from the biological perspective would be neural influences. Essentially, abnormal brains, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for judgments, can contribute to abnormally aggressive behavior. This is seen when they look at prefrontal cortex development in murderers and persons who are more prone to violence. It seems to be underdeveloped. Heredity, also influences the neural system's sensitivity to aggression. And the best example of this would be breeding animals for aggressiveness, which would be higher in specific types of dogs. Example, the pit bull that is going to be genetically more aggressive. So we have neural influences as it relates to the brain, prefrontal cortex being underdeveloped, and then we also have just general heredity, where some persons or types of persons may be more genetically predisposed to aggression or aggressiveness. So research has consistently found that alcohol also unleashes aggression, and we're still on the biological perspectives of aggression. And in addition to alcohol, testosterone has been linked with aggression, greater levels of testosterone is found in males and females. And then we also have found that there is lower serotonin involved, that is found in persons who are involved in violent acts. And it makes sense because the frontal lobes actually have a lot of serotonin receptors, so it's actually kind of working together with this whole brain functioning, right? And then final part for this is the interaction between behavior and biology. So we know that high testosterone increases likelihood of aggression, dominating behavior, that kind of thing. But also what has been found is when persons, and the research around this would have been done on sports persons or people who are in high competitive situations, when they exhibit dominating or defeating behavior, testosterone levels are boosted. Frustration is the blocking of goal-directed behavior. And some theorists suggest that frustration always leads to aggressive behavior, and this is the frustration aggression theory. This theory that frustration triggers a readiness to aggress. Frustration, of course, being a word that we don't often use, but a lot of times captures some of the emotion that we are feeling when we are impeded from getting to what it is that we are working toward. And it is important to note, here is the model for the classic version of the frustration aggression theory, that the aggressive energy does not always need to explode directly. So when you look at it, remove the arrows, there is an option for it to explode directly, but it can also be displaced, and this is often through learning how to inhibit our retaliation. So if you recall from Psych 100 again, Freud's proposed defense mechanisms, where we redirect the aggression to target some other thing or person. Most times not a person, but sometimes it could be a person, somebody who we deem to be less than us, who's not able to quote unquote fight back. But sometimes it is to, something. But essentially it is where we are taking anger out and it's not on the actual source. Now, Berkowitz revised this theory because the thought was that there was an overstating of the frustration-aggression connection. What he suggests is that frustration produces anger, and this is an emotional readiness to aggress. Anger arises when someone who frustrates us could have chosen to act otherwise. It's important to note that this theory is designed to explain hostile aggression, not instrumental, so not the means to the end. But the actual act of taking out your anger on the source. What the revised suggests is that a person who is frustrated is likely to lash out when aggressive cues pull the proverbial cork, releasing the bottled up anger. However, sometimes it has been noted that the cork will blow without such cues. All right. So we're still on theories of aggression. Now this one is relative deprivation. The best way to frustrate yourself, especially for where you are at, is to compare yourself to someone else. Relative deprivation is this perception that one is less well off than others with whom one compares oneself. This phenomenon explains why happiness tends to be lower and crime rates higher in communities and nations where the income inequality is significant. So you have huge, millionaires, trillionaires kind of thing, and then you have people who are living in abject poverty. We see it to some degree here when I think about what is the money that comes here, but I think for the most part we don't necessarily interact with them. These have traditionally been persons who would have lived and remained in the communities, in the gated communities of Life for Key, Ocean Club, that kind of stuff. But I think this is changing a little bit with the rise of the quote unquote number boys, because we are seeing them move into levels of wealth that may not have necessarily been characteristic of the everyday Bahamian, and a lot of them are the everyday or represent the everyday Bahamian. And so now we may start to see some of this significant difference as they get more wealthier and the average person, resources are getting even more limited. Okay, so we learn aggressive behaviors. Social psychologists suggest that there are rewards of aggression, and essentially what happens is through experience and by observing others, we learn that aggression often pays. For example, the bully, who, for the most part, it may have only taken once or twice that they would have taken advantage of or intimidated a person, and then that person not only fears them, but also maybe people who are directly in that circle. So let's say they picked on, for lack of a better word, the nerd of the class, and then like all of the other nerds then kind of learn to fear. And so what happens is now this person is instilling fear, and it's going to get wider and wider as it continues. And so this is now feeding into this feat that they have successfully intimidated and is achieving some social status, because now they're going to be revered in some ways. Not necessarily a good thing, right? Um, but attention and power doesn't have to always be positive for it to still be validating. Myers also references terrorism as being rewarded as people who were just everyday, generally powerless people, no social standing, no real power, garner not only attention, but also now have some impact, some power, as they would have caused widespread fear. And if we look at the image there, this is a great segue into the next slide, where we really go through the observational learning and social learning theory, which we would have found the result of kids experiencing harsh disciplinary practices meant that they would have been more likely to be aggressive in their interactions with others. During the 1960s, Albert Bandura conducted a series of experiments on observational learning. I think everybody does call them the Bobo doll experiments. The idea was he was interested in investigating if social behaviors, particularly aggression, can be acquired by observation and imitation. And what happened was these students, these kids, preschoolers in particular, so imagine my darling 4-year-old that I always talk about, being placed in a room, and he or she is able to see into the other room. In the other room, there is an adult person there, and they are working on something at a desk. And then after a couple of minutes, the adult just gets up, grabs a mallet, and literally starts like whacking the mess out of a Bobo doll, as you see in the top two pictures. This kid is pretty much minding their own business. They are coloring, they walk, they are then escorted into a next room. Next room, there are some amazing toys of all kinds of colors and types and everything. But the child is told that hey, you can't necessarily play with all of these toys. You got to save them for some of the other kids. And then they are escorted from that room, which is like heaven, for a preschooler, and then moves into a next room. And in the next room, there are some toys again. And in specific, the toys are both aggressive, or ones that could be used for aggression, and those that are just kind of general. In all instances, well, not all, but I think in the majority of the instances where the child would have been exposed to the adult hitting the Bobo doll, the child then, when placed in the second classroom, would have picked up the mallet and been hitting the Bobo doll. And you can see both boys and girls did it alike. Where the child did not see that, where they did not see the person taking the mallet and hitting the Bobo doll, they did not do the same. And of course, unless a child has been exposed to certain things, they wouldn't know what to use it for. And a mallet, unless they would have seen somebody taking it to hit somebody, they would probably use it to, would be more likely would be to like hammer something or to make noise, that kind of thing, not to actually be aggressive with. So all of this came together and under the proposed idea of social learning theory. And this is really where we learn social behavior by observing and imitating, and then this is rewarded and punished. So again, the principles of learning, if you would recall from Psych 100. Now, just before we move on, a couple small points as it relates to the family. Physically aggressive children tend to have had physically punitive parents, and they would have been disciplined, And by this type of discipline, then they would have had aggression modeled for them with screaming, slapping, and beating, just to give some examples. There have also been family influences that have been tied to higher violence rates in certain cultures and families where there have been absentee fathers. And unfortunately, even in 2000, there was some research that was done, and when American children who were raised without fathers were like X amount of times more likely, 7 times more likely to be abused, drop out of school, become runaways, become teen parents, and to commit violent crimes. So there's definitely a connection between family in which you are exposed to or not exposed to, and some of the outcomes as it relates to your behaviors as adults. Now, culture also falls in this, and broad culture does matter. So there are the wider culture as it relates to what is expected of you. Certain types of behaviors are encouraged. If we think back a couple years, persons would have been prepped and they would have known that life as an adult male meant going to war or being enlisted in the service. But even in addition to the larger culture, there are some subcultures and communities, and this again typically relates to males, where that machismo or that macho and that aggression is what is revered or valuable for social identity, as well as in some subcultures where you learn that aggression is the way to get social status. Yeah. All right, folks, we are going to stop there rather than jumping into the next section, which will take this way longer than 20 minutes. So when we jump back in, we'll finish up the chapter.